This is a perennial digression, an extended experiment in imposing my thinly undiagnosed ADHD on others. I'm David Armstrong, but more importantly, I'm joined once again by David Bentley Hart, scholar, philosopher, theologian, author, fantasy novelist, baseball fan, and dog lover. David, thanks for agreeing to do this again. It's a really generous use of your time.
Thanks for having me. We'll discuss at some other time the order of descriptions there.
So I tried to save the ones that I thought you would find most important for last, right? Like I tried to build up the mountain there.
Yeah, So I prefer to think of myself as a writer rather than a fantasy novelist, just because the novel that's coming out happens to be in a certain genre. But
right, there you go.
Okay. Yeah. Okay.
I notice, and I'm not as in the trade as you are, so you could probably tell me more about it. But I noticed that descriptions for authors tend to change with the things that they publish, like especially if they change genres, right? So, if you write a book of poems after having written essays, suddenly now like you're the poet, right?
Yes. I could, in fact, certain acquaintances of mine I've seen described as a poet, and it's not the word that would immediately spring to my lips, but they just happen to have published poetry in the near past. So
yeah. So the conversation I pitched to you last time was on eschatological horizons. The one that I've pitched to you this time I've titled Otherworlds. In consideration of your newsletters this past month on Gnosticism, your forthcoming book that you mentioned last time on the show, Kinogaya. I've been working on my Demotic Greek for you, by the way. So mea maxima culpa if I mispronounce something or if I get caught between the two.
Well, to be honest, in Demotic Greek, you would say Kinogaya.
Right.
So, if you're so we'll split the difference. Kinogaya.
Yeah. My pronunciation.
It is an epsilon, not an eta. No.
Right. Okay. Kinogaya. So is it empty Earth or new Earth then?
Keno, empty, okay. Not Keno, not Kinogaya, not Kenoya, but Kenoya or Kinogaya.
Okay, there you go. This is why truly Erasmus ruined Greek, right?
Well, in it's the world where the story takes place is called Kinogaya, and much of it in the largest city there called Kinopolis. So,
I feel like I'm going to enjoy that book.
If you don't, we'll have words. But whether you enjoy it or not, what's important is that you buy it.
Yes, of course.
Right.
Of course. Roland is like one of the only physical books I've bought this year. Since marriage, I've realized that even though ebooks are not my preference, they just take up so much less space.
Well, I had that traumatic experience of dissolving a library of about 29,000 volumes. Now I still got thousands of books. People still come into the house and say, "Oh, you have so many books," and to me, the shelves look bare because I'm recalling the ridiculous collection I had, and many of those books are irreplaceable because in the days before the internet, as you know, again and again, you go into used bookstores, especially when I lived in England, and find real treasures for practically nothing. Like Walter Pater's copy of Tacitus, in the bookstore in Cambridge for £5.
Yeah.
Something first editions of William Morris, say, or something that from the Kelmscott Press, and now, if I were to try to replace those going online, be thousands of dollars actually, just for that one volume. So I too have gotten used to using a Kindle. I don't like it. I mean, in one hand, I do like being able to carry thousands of books with me anywhere in a small space. But there's something about not being able to flip back and forth and go back to a passage you read earlier easily or something that definitely detracts from the pleasure of reading. And in some ways, the Kindle just encourages you to read straight through without break. And I'm not sure that's the way one really should properly read a book if one's really immersing oneself in it.
Yeah, I think it's unforgivable that there's still academic books that are published on Kindle that don't have page numbers.
Oh yeah.
So Columbia University Press is actually the biggest offender here I've found. Almost any book I buy.
Well, it's one of them.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So
I though recently got the nice new, I can't remember the scholar's name, edition of Zhuangzi, and it very helpfully includes the print numbers in brackets throughout. So,
oh, good, yeah. There was a great article on I know you know about Aeon.co because you've written for them. They have a side magazine, Psyche, and someone had written about Zhuangzi's concept of time in that. And so I felt particularly brave last year and decided to see if my middle schoolers could work through that and identify some of the rhetoric in it. But anyway, digressions. What else do you come here for?
I'm pretty sure that's the whole purpose of the of the podcast or the cat, whatever you call these things.
Yeah,
Zoom cat.
Yeah, conversations, and the way I've been describing it when my wife asks me how it's going is like, among my experiments, it's one of my better ones for sure.
Certainly worked better than your automatic pie slicer, which was, if you don't mind my saying, something of a disaster.
Yeah, that's not even my best kitchen gadget is the problem, right?
Yeah.
So last time, talking about eschatology, I'm sure that eschatology won't entirely escape us today, but the main one, like if last time was about time, this time I wanted to talk to you about space. So cosmology, metaphysics, etc. To that end, my first question is actually just about your relationship to fantasy literature as a genre. What inspired you to write a fantasia, or is it more a romance, or how would you describe Kinogaya?
Therapy. Well, you've read Roland, I had a very serious illness that was of a sort that preyed not only on the body, but the mind. And when I first went to St. Louis, I was still very, very sick, having trouble breathing. And I couldn't read. I couldn't concentrate on anything, which was a new experience for me. So I decided to write something in order to make my brain kick in again, to write a book without any, just to write a story, not to write something that required footnotes or the other tedious things that make academic writing more of a chore than a pleasure. And I had this idea, believe it or not, as a kind of subversive long form take on The Little Prince. You might, when you read it, you might see how that could be in the background. But, the same sort of, and Gnostic story. I mean, Gnosticism just gives you a great story. I mean, it just does, as I think has been established again and again in science fiction films. I'm not a great lover of the genre, I have to be honest. I mean, I read fantasies when I was young, and the classic ones like Well at the End of the World and things like that, or George MacDonald's books had a huge influence on forming my imagination. And when I was 12, I liked Tolkien. I don't really care for it anymore, but just because the prose is so damned horrible. I hate to say it. I'm sorry. I mean, I know that's blasphemy for many Christians, to be told that I'm just not a big Tolkien fan, but I'm not. And my taste in although I mean, in a sense, I like fantastical literature in the sense that I'm very much drawn to, say, Latin American or Middle European fiction of a sort that is not at all slavishly bound to the realist tradition. I mean, I think realism in the novel was a mistake. It had its triumphs, but at the point at which we discovered that we preferred reading about the slow course of a divorce rather than Achilles and Hector outside the walls of Troy, I think that was ultimately more of a diminishment than an enlargement of our sensibility culturally.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, I mean, I wouldn't normally have written a fantasy novel. I would have written something perhaps with fantastic elements in it, and maybe that's splitting hairs. But in this case, I wrote the first half in St. Louis just as a kind of therapy. I would have finished it then, except that I then went to the Institute for Advanced Studies and got deep. Now that I could concentrate again, it had helped me actually in that way. Got into the project on mind and consciousness and soul, and started writing other things. I had other books, the translation of the New Testament to finish. And so I got around to finishing the book in the first part of the COVID shutdown. I had about 300 pages written. I wrote another 300. And then I sat down and wrote Roland and Moonlight in about a month and a half. It was as you can see, there was a lot of energy that needed discharging.
Yeah.
That said, I find that, I mean, it's not that I'm hostile, understand to the fantasy genre. I just don't think there are many good writers in the genre. I mean, and every time someone comes along that I'm told is good, and I pick it up and I just go,
Yeah. Yeah, I grew up so you've not offended me by any comments about Tolkien. I mean,
I grew up somewhat too. I mean, I liked the Earthsea novels when I was a kid too, and all sorts of, or the first three.
I grew up on a steady diet of Lewis and Tolkien, and I still love them as I'm older. But one of the things I've realized is that there is something. First, there are limitations to their vision. And there's an intellectual and a creative danger in sort of hanging on their every literary taste and theological tendency,
Yeah.
And I think that's the only thing. Yeah, go ahead.
No, go on. You finish.
Oh, I was just going to say. I mean, I think it's, my only kind of problem with celebration, like the whole Inklings culture that surrounds them. I mean, I like in certain aspects of it really continue to, like nourish or help me in some way. But what bothers me is that it becomes its own kind of traditionalism of like, we want to live in mid 20th century, Oxford literary conservatism. And it's like, well, I live in St. Louis, that's not only is that not the world anymore, like it's never been my world,
Now, my background ethnically is sort of basically pan-British with just a soupçon of French in there. That's typical of people from Maryland who go back to the colonial days. But my family, got here in 1634. I mean, it would be rather silly of me to pretend that my life experience, I wouldn't say we were Anglophiles, but we were Anglocentric. I mean, that was just the literature we read, but even the TV and the radio that I grew up on all came from Britain. The Avengers and The Prisoner and My Word and My Music. It's just that was normal. That was East Coast ethnic Britishism. But on the whole, the sort of the Inklings culture does encourage a kind of infatuation with a fantasy alternative 20th century that overlooks, among other things, the social and moral limitations of that culture as well. It's not just that, though. I mean, the truth is, I just after a while, the sensibility I find thins out. I don't find the richness that at the age of 12 I found there. I mean, my mind, but I'm grateful for I guess reading Tolkien early on interested me in northern languages, for instance, and learning. It turned me towards the Edda and the Volsung Saga and all sorts of things. And so, I mean, his weird inability to enjoy any literature after the Norman conquest, I find a little bit on the costive side. And as I say, I mean, there's about Tolkien's prose. It's just, my God, it's bad at most of the time. There are moments when it's good, when he's writing about things sparkling in the darkness, things that really take his imagination, and that northernness he talked about comes to life. But when he's being lyrical, it's usually just bad Tennyson. His fear of any Latinate words creates these remarkably dull paragraphs, because the English language, the music of English, as say Shakespeare understood, is its polyglot, its polyphonic resources. It's a beautiful language only when you exploit its mongrel riches, and Tolkien's, Anglo-Saxonism in everything, to the point where I realized this when I reread The Lord of the Rings as an adult. And there's a point early on in the book when Frodo uses the word realize, and it's so out of place because of how obsessively Anglo-Saxon the vocabulary has been. And then there are all the sort of clumsy artistic errors, like, describing the early on the impression the hobbits have of the fireworks in the form of a dragon going overhead as being like a freight train.
Yeah.
But of course, even though it's written in the third person, he's writing from the perspective of the hobbits, who would never have seen a freight train, I mean, and it's full of, there were just all sorts of things that drove me insane. And I guess I'm being a bit precious here, but I mean, if you have a kind of leaning towards a Nabokovian or Proustian finesse, and then let's be honest, for richness of character development, I mean, Aragorn isn't really Karenin, is he? I mean, he isn't really. Yeah.
He begins and ends in effectively the same place emotionally in terms of a character. I honestly,
I don't know. If I don't even know if there's that much consistency. I mean, that's the thing. Well, no, there isn't. I mean, I also noticed that when reading it, is Aragorn's a total cipher until he picks up one of those orbs called the ones television.
Oh, he picks up the Orthanc and he speaks to Sauron through it, right?
Right, and suddenly a whole side of his personality that was entirely absent till then becomes prominent. No, so I have problems with it, but the books are better than those damned films that Peter Jackson made.
That's true. I truthfully, in Tolkien's corpus, I think that the Silmarillion is much better than the Lord of the Rings.
Yeah, no, I always enjoyed that more. I enjoyed that much more because it didn't call on him to do the sort of things he really didn't have a gift for, like conversation.
Right.
And also of the novels, I like The Hobbit better than The Lord of the Rings.
It's a much better. And it's interesting that Tolkien hated The Hobbit in his later career, but it is much better written.
It's just much better book. It's a well told story. It's got one flaw. I mean, the death of Smaug comes too quickly and too anticlimactically as a kind of Deus ex machina, but. Other than that, it's much more. It's a delightful book. Mirkwood is a wonderful invention. It's great fairy tale stuff. George MacDonald would have approved.
Yeah, in Lewis, I think. I mean, I always enjoyed the Narnia, but I think reading Michael Ward's Planet Narnia thesis in college gave me more respect for Lewis's sort of architecture to what he wrote than I'd previously had. Are you familiar with this argument at all?
No,
So
I don't read. I don't.
Sure. Yeah.
I'm not a big Inklings guy, so I don't read books about them. No,
so Ward did his doctoral dissertation where he made the argument that the controlling logic for the 7 Narnia books are the 7 pre-Copernican heavens that Lewis is otherwise everywhere obsessed with.
Yeah.
And the argument's basically so lucidly self-evident that you kind of wonder how nobody else has made it in the last 50 years or so.
Well, I have to say, I mean, the things I like in those books, I do like the way he plundered, let's say, John Mandeville and Odo and, things for the Voyage of the Dawn Treader, and the way he used ancient cosmology. I mean, I share with both. I mean, honestly, the things they loved, I love. I love classical literature. I love Northern European myth and all that. As long, as for the Narnia books themselves, I have mixed feelings for them. I like the first half of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. The second half, the allegory is so ponderously obvious and is based on bad theology, actually, that it's kind of annoying. Prince Caspian bores me stiff. But Voyage of the Dawn Treader, that's fun. I'm trying to remember the order here. Silverchair is a masterpiece. I think that is a genuinely great novel for young people, but also, I mean, as an allegory. That I think that Until We Have Faces are his two triumphs.
I really thought you'd love The Silver Chair because that's the Luna book. It's the book that's
okay,
lunar. So Aslan never appears in Narnia itself because Narnia is being emphasized as the sublunary realm. So he sort of can't get in for the whole book, basically, because of Luna's interfering everything. So yeah, okay. So I don't mean to wait.
Well, this is a good way to start a conversation about Otherworlds. I mean, in the Anglophone canon, the Inklings are one of the significant. I mean, we haven't talked about Charles Williams, whom I also don't really care for. I like some of the stories, the ideas of the early novels, but every time someone tells me Descent into Hell is a masterpiece, I think that the person has been just eating too much peyote. Because
I like his idea.
It is anything but a masterpiece. It's an absolute disaster of a book. But Anyway.
So
written so badly, actually, that it makes David Lindsay's Voyage Dark Tourist suddenly seem like Walter Pater,
So another writer I know you have some distaste for. I think I remember reading you say this once. I'm curious if you have any preferences in horror fiction. I know that you don't like Lovecraft very much.
If you love the English language, how could you?
Now I will say I do a fun lesson with my middle schoolers every October where we talk about the concepts of settled and liminal space in literature, and then we read the one piece by Lovecraft that I really like, which is his poem October. Do you know that one?
Yeah.
Mellow-faced with eyes of fairy, all of that. So we read it, and
as a fourth tier ghoulish imitation of Keats. It's
So horror fiction.
Fruitfulness. No, I like ghost stories. I don't like horror fiction. So I like M.R.J. I love M.R. James and Sheridan Le Fanu and Arthur Machen to a great degree. And Machen, of course, there was more horror elements, but I love ghost stories. I love Japanese ghost stories above all, which are not really horror stories at all so much as just wonderful, and the best of them, wonderful evocations of the uncanny and the sort of strange menace of a world we don't understand on the other side of things. So I have a deep taste for that, for ghost stories. I love them. But I detest sort of Stephen King style horror. I've tried on like 2 or 3 occasions actually to read a Stephen King novel. Again, there's the obstacle of the prose, which should be illegal. There's sentences in Stephen King that really should be capital offenses, if I believed in capital punishment. Let's just say should come with a prison sentence. Sentences that can, there's a joke in there somewhere. I'm just too tedious. I'm just too tired to make it. But no, I mean, I hate that kind of the sort of gore. And now, I mean, he may have triumphed somewhere or other, but I mean, there's a certain lack of subtlety. I mean, he always seems to, from what I can tell, his villains are always, so over the top that the Disney studios couldn't have come up with something quite so clearly. This is the villain,
You'll love this. My one of my best and certainly my oldest friend, he lives like 10 minutes from me here. his wife is Japanese, and she one time told him that American ghosts are not scary. She's like, I've seen Japanese ghosts. American ghosts are not scary. No, it's like, wow. that's
no. I mean, I think there are these wonderful traditions in East Asian culture, in general, of ghost stories. I mean, Pusongling, for instance, stories from scholars' workshop or shed, or however you translate it, has wonderful ghost stories, and a lot of Tang Dynasty ghost stories are just perfect. But the Japanese, I think, do it best of all. I really do. I think that just the feel, if you've ever read Ugetsu Monogatari, from which vaguely was made the greatest of Mizoguchi's films, Ugetsu Monogatari. Actually, maybe the greatest film ever made, and certainly one I find impossible not to go back to again and again. Or the Japanese stories that Lafcadio Hearn collected and translated in books like Kwaidan, I just think are wonderful, and have a feel about them that I find endlessly fascinating. But I mean, I also like, E.F. Benson or Edith Wharton or L.C. Rolt, some of Robert Aikman, anyone who could write a ghost story. What I like about ghost stories are the atmosphere, if they're well done, which requires a certain subtlety, which differentiates them from horror. The sense of the uncanny, not the sense of the grotesque, is what I find appealing. And it's amazing how many really good ghostwriters are just excellent writers, or John Masefield, another example, or Elsie, the fellow who wrote The Go-Between.
I'm not.
It'll come to me. It'll come to me. Anyway.
Yeah. Go ahead.
No, that's it. I was just going to say that L.P. Hartley, that was it. I was trying to remember who wrote the Go Between. L.P. Hartley. He also wrote quite a few very good ghost stories.
This is good because I'm looking for something spooky to read in honor of the month. So I will go back over this later.
Well, I just gave you a catalog of names to go through.
It's a syllabus unto itself, Okay, so kind of establishing ourselves here in this literary frame of mind on Otherworlds. Let's talk about Gnosticism a bit. Don't have to do it all at once, but a bit. I know it's a big and hazy topic. It's the way it's used in public discourse, but weirdly, even in scholarly discourse on religion, I mean, it's basically a fiction, as you pointed out at length over on your Substack. So for those who haven't read the newsletter, without removing their incentive to go and subscribe to it, which, by the way, go subscribe to Leaves in the Wind, David Bentley Hart's Substack newsletter, not blog.
Not a blog, yeah.
Yes, not a blog. What generally should everybody know about Gnosticism as an ancient phenomenon? Like, just kind of getting into it the way you think best.
Well, I mean, to begin with, to know that as a distinct category that supposedly that represents some kind of unified movement or at least sensibility. The category of Gnosticism comes from the 17th century, from Henry More, I think. Borrowing, Irenaeus's description of these groups as selling a false gnosis, a false knowledge. But certainly before then, no one spoke of Gnosticism as a unified phenomenon. But the thing I'm anxious for people to know is, I do think the term can still be used with caution to indicate certain kinds of mystery religions attached to Christianity at the time that had huge sort of argosies of mythological hypostases in them, and that were radically dualist to a degree that the proto-Orthodox tradition wasn't. The thing I'm actually most anxious for people to understand is the degree to which much of what we think of as distinctively Gnostic wasn't distinctive at all. Is actually just a feature of late antique Greco-Roman religion, including the Judaism of the time and early Christianity, and how much of what we associate with Gnosticism, apart from things that are obviously bizarre, like the huge, pre-cosmic myths of the Pleroma and all that, which, I mean, they may have been allegories for all we know. We don't know how seriously they were taken, but assuming they weren't, okay, but much of the rest, the basic morphology and story, how much of it shares in common with and comes and takes directly from Christian scripture. And the reason for emphasizing this is, first of all, to try to disabuse ourselves of later understandings of what the early Christians were, of the sort that you get in the popular discourse, especially Protestant culture, and try to situate those cults in their time in order to understand what kind of spiritual anxieties and what sort of spiritual imagination dominated the world into which Christianity came, and to which it made a contribution that, to a great degree, contains to some degree the pathos of what we call Gnosticism. Once you've done that, once you've seen how, see, even using the word orthodoxy here is difficult, because pre-Nicaea, many of these groups that we would now sort of casually class together on the Orthodox side, just as those that we class together on the Gnostic side, actually don't have a lot in common. There would be very, very broad disagreements about Christology, and so, for instance, or about the Trinity, or whether they even think in terms of a Trinity, or, many of those whom we now think of as fitting into the stream of later Orthodoxy came from ages and places where they would have thought of Christ as the incarnate great angel rather than the actual, Son of God in the full Trinitarian sense that Nicaea elucidates. Once you've identified where these movements and the proto-Orthodox streams of Christianity coincide, then you can start making intelligent distinctions. And it does clarify. I mean, don't we see how the early Christians were dealing with this set of, how did they deal with, on the one hand, the rather strong, if provisional, dualist language in Paul and John, and yet at the other hand, the simultaneous affirmation of the goodness of creation and the redemption of the cosmos rather than its abandonment, because you have both languages right side by side in Paul, especially. And you can see, how a certain rationality based, first of all, on soteriology, but also on a more and more sophisticated adoption of the metaphysical resources of the Greco-Roman Hellenistic world, especially, begins to distinguish the great church tradition from just another mystery cult of the sort that what we call the Gnosticisms probably were ultimately. I mean, I'm sure Valentinus was a very impressive man, but ultimately the synthesis he produced was probably yet another mystery cult, like the Orphic cults, this one within the fold of Christian language, but still didn't answer the questions with, say, the kind of richness that, or at least the kind of seeming consistency with which the Orthodox tradition would.
Yeah, it seems to me that Gnosticism is one of those catalysts for what I don't have better language to describe other than there seem to me to be like two stages in coming to know early Christianity. There's one stage where you sort of broadly recognize like, oh, Catholicism, Orthodoxy, Higher Church Anglicanism, the Church of the East, these things are all a lot more similar to ancient Christianity than like, the evangelicalism I grew up with or something. But then there's a second stage where you like read more and you get more kind of in touch with the primary sources, and you realize that actually before the 4th century, it's just the Wild West, right?
Yeah.
Like there's no automatic narrative of how this was going to go.
No. And anyone who thinks that what happened at Nicaea was simply the confirmation of a pre-existing Orthodox consensus is living in a daydream. I mean, that's just that is the story. I mean, this is what happens with the establishment of an orthodoxy, and then under Theodosius with the imposition of that orthodoxy as basically the law. A huge ideological reconstruction of the past takes place. Now that's natural anyway. Whenever we're trying to understand the roots of the present, we read the past in terms of the present. So we emphasize certain things that were not necessarily salient or even dispositive at the time, but seem to us significant now, and push other evidences to the side. But in this case, it really is, it really is a case of the imposition of an orthodoxy that was distilled from what went before it, but that existed nowhere, anywhere within the pre-Nicene world in its totality. There was nowhere before Nicaea that there were Nicene Christians. And in fact, well after Nicaea, there were no Nicene Christians, because what we mean by Nicene is the ultimate synthesis of Nicaea, Constantinople, supplemented with Chalcedonian Christology, supplemented with Neo-Chalcedonian theology, and the other thing, another reason for understanding Gnosticism, understanding its language, understanding also, as you say, when you go back to the original Christian sources, what's one of the great barriers to, say, just some undergraduate who doesn't read Greek, seeing, if you introduce him to the Gnostic literature, he finds it all just outlandish. Well, some of what he finds outlandish is outlandish, perhaps, like the story of Barbello or Sophia Prunikos or whatever. But also, is one of these archons. What's this notion of archons ruling over the heavenly spheres? Because, of course, the translations of Scripture they're familiar with translate those words, rulers, principalities, powers. And there's a long tradition of thinking and even teaching, that's a reference to human agencies, powers.
Right.
Whereas the Gnostic literature seemed to be some sort of tacit agreement among translators that they would leave the word archon in place and not turn it into ruler. This way, emphasize the strangeness of it. So part of it is just, reintegrating one's sense of that first century and realizing that say Paul's reading of, or rather say Valentinus's or whoever's reading of Paul is not nearly so strange and perverse as we'd like to imagine.
Yeah. Well, and it's part and parcel the way that we come to it with this expectation of what monotheism has to mean. And I know you've written on this in tons of places, right? But we come with this assumption that, ancient Israelites are monotheists and early Jews are monotheists, and that means one divine being who's sort of doing all the labor and it can't admit of other divine principles or entities or whatever. What we miss when we do that is, of course, like, as anybody who's not approaching this from an intellectual position of I need it to say this, right?
Yeah.
So this is what it's going to say.
Which I call, just in a completely neutral and non-polemical sense, the NT Wright approach.
Yeah. So like NT Wright's approach, right? There's a theological byline and like the history has to support it. And so we've got to read it this way. And the problem with doing that is, it's not a very good reading of the texts, right? Like if you read through the Hebrew Bible, it's very obvious that the editors and redactors of the Tanakh are trying to sort of apologize for and sort of paper over the fact that pre-exilic Israelite religion is basically a local form of Canaanite religion, right? And that their divinity does undergo an evolution from being like a tribal god,
or two tribal god,
right? Or yeah, I mean, like it's obvious that, you know, there I would break this down to, there's one way of reading the Hebrew Bible that says, oh, El just means God in Hebrew, even though it means something else in Canaanite, right? And then there's another way of reading it that says, no, like they're talking about El, like they're calling him El, right?
El Elyon, yeah, the old man of the valley, and all that. And well, I mean, the thing is, the redactors didn't successfully cover up all the traces, did they? I mean, say that Elohim bara, that Elohim singular create, but I mean, just the very name Elohim is not just an honorific plural. We know that behind it lies, and just the Yahwist narrative of Eden, we again and again, not just of Eden, but through Genesis, Tower of Babel too, and again and again, we have the original myth spilling through, in which Yahweh has to go to the other gods and say, well, look, oh dear, they've eaten the fruit of the knowledge of value and valueless. I mean, that's really what it is. What if they eat the tree of life? They'll be rivals to us, so we got to kick them out of the garden. Or look, they've invented the brick.
Yeah.
How can we resist their power? Now, that's what the Tower of Babel's. It's what I do love. If you insist on being a literalist, I made this point actually in an interview I did just yesterday with David Artman. His name's very much like yours, but he's a fellow who does a universalist.
I know him actually. Yeah.
Okay. The Gnostics, one of the ways in which you could distinguish them from the developing Orthodox tradition is say that apparently many of them were the first fundamentalists, because they read these stories and took them at face value and believed them and realized that the God described in these stories, and literalists in the modern sense, that is, I mean, not just reading ad literam, but they're actually that they had no notion of allegorical reading or of an inspired allegorical interpretation. So, of course, when they read that the story of Eden, they notice, as for some reason our fundamentalists don't, that the snake is telling the truth and the Yahweh is lying, and they don't know, so they say, well, this is an inferior demiurge. Why does he have to go through the garden calling Adam, Eve? Why? Surely isn't he supposed to be omniscient? So they turn, they arrive at the conclusion that this isn't actually, these stories don't concern the real God. Or the Tower of Babel. I mean, it's amazing the way we read through the tradition. You can give that to a good fundamentalist white evangelical fellow, and he'll still see the story of an attempt to storm heaven by force, whereas in fact what actually is on the page is that Yahweh goes down one day and sees, oh my gosh, they can create buildings all the way up into the sky, 3 or 4 stories. If they have this kind of technology, what is the brick? Oh my, the brick. If they have that sort of technology, how long will it be before they overthrow the gods and take their place? Yeah. So we better scatter them. It's a very familiar sort of Mesopotamian kind of picture of the gods. The gods are not all that good. They're not all that bright. Why you have to worship them is apparently just a matter of prudence. And that layer of the myth shows through. Yeah. And the Gnostics, so-called, apparently, just, were not, whereas they were blessed with great mythopoetic inventiveness, they weren't blessed with a great deal of hermeneutical sophistication.
Right. This is all relevant because this week the Parsha is actually Bereshit.
That's true.
Yeah. And so I think, as you're talking about,
have you ever noticed that in the Hebrew, the very first verse of Genesis seems to start with a grammatical error?
Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz. Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, go on. Go on.
Yeah, no. Well, my thing is silly. I was going to say, when you were talking about Babel, it reminded me of one of those classic Simpsons episodes where Homer takes up a snowplow business, and he says to his friend, when two friends work together, not even God himself can stop them. And then you just hear a giant divine voice saying, "Wanna bet?" Like, the finger of God comes down out of the sky and melts all the snow. But like, yeah, as you're saying, like, the Gnostics read that and they're like, no, yeah, like, that God sucks. Like, we're not, that's not the God we should serve.
Yeah. And having a very late antique, even if they weren't the sharpest metaphysicians in the shed, they were immersed in a religious culture that had philosophical depths to it, more or less written into its terms, and they had some understanding of what real divine transcendence should look like. Not just now they turn. For them, this transcendence becomes effectively an absence, obviously, because God the Father's inaccessibility becomes ultimately a complete disjunction between the being and intentions of God and the created order, rather than a deputed secondary act performed in and by a Defteros Theos, or the Son, or Logos, or whatever. But nonetheless, having a decent sense that a transcendent God should actually be transcendent, and then asked actually to read, and then reading Genesis in a straightforward sense, and finding there the story of a clearly limited and rather spiteful God in some ways. They saw that as somehow a key to the more dualistic language you find in John and Paul. Maybe the prince of this, the archon of this cosmos, really is a reference to that God of Genesis.
Yeah, well, and I think too, this is where knowledge, right, of the changing demographics and social contexts of early Christianity is important, because in the context of Jewish apocalyptic, a Jewish apocalypticist is a lot more likely to read that through like Enoch or Jubilees and be like, oh, the archon of this world is a fallen divinity or a fallen angel, but not ultimately the God that the Hebrew Bible is talking about. But in a context where like fewer and fewer members of the communities are Jews anyway, and there is
right.
long-standing Greco-Roman anti-Semitism, it's like an easy move to just say, oh yeah, like the Jewish God is the inferior God in that context.
Right. Yeah. No, I think that's precisely correct.
Yeah. So we've kind of already touched on. Oh, go ahead.
Let's not, though, leave out the emphasis, though, that these articles are out there. That it's not just purely a negative take on the. There's the alternative. The Gnostic sensibility, what we call Gnosticism, much of it, if you separate it from this category Gnosticism and talk about these particular elements, which are pretty easy to enumerate, actually. Directly from Scripture, that the absence of that. Sorry, I'm having trouble with my screen here all at once.
No trouble.
Suddenly
no worries.
Begun flickering, and I don't know where you are. I've lost you. Let's see. Zoom. Yeah, you've disappeared. Are you still there?
Oh, I can see you. You're still coming through for me. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. I just can't see you.
Yeah. I've become a Gnostic deity to this conversation.
Oh, well, it was probably, hold on, I think I found you.
There we go.
You were at the top of my screen in a tiny little box that was receding from us. Okay, there you are. Actually, the view was better beforehand. Let me go back.
Let me get a good look at you.
I always got that hat on. I've always wondered, if you take the hat off, what's underneath it? Are you bald?
So I'm bald, but I wasn't always. I used to actually.
Well, neither was I.
Yeah. I used to have hair that like cascaded down my shoulders, and it's not even that I'm embarrassed about being bald. It's just that I actually recognize myself better with something on my head. It's weird. Nobody tells you start losing your hair in your 20s. Oh, your volume. Oh, there you are. I think I can hear you now.
All right. Can you hear me?
I can hear you now. Yeah, your volume went away for just a second there.
How very peculiar. Yeah, it's the connection on my. I have this lovely microphone, but the connection on it is apparently improperly. But never mind, it's boring. As long as you can hear me now, we'll just continue. In any event, yeah. So, well, no, I used to have my hair down to almost to my waist. I used to, so maybe that's why I'm bald now.
So I'm preaching to the choir.
That, oh yeah, no, I was a total sort of hippie.
Yeah, I used to when I
after the fact is my because by that time it was phasing out. There were a few of us in high school who were still holding to the aesthetic of the late '60s, but on the whole, we were a small fugitive and militant group, insisting that basically there had been no popular music produced since, I don't know, like Exile on Main Street. So people were listening to music of the '80s, which, as far as I can tell, consists entirely in an electronic pulse. Yeah. Every song in the '80s is just a static electronic pulse.
Well, no, I mean, if I didn't already like you enough, when you mentioned that thing about the British invasion on your Substack, I was just like, now I can truly trust your intellect, knowing that you love the the Beatles, the Kinks, the Stones, and the Who. I mean, for goodness sake,
those are the big four.
That's it. That's music died afterwards now.
Well, no, you have to understand in my generation that we were always waiting for the next Dylan album. But I mean, look, I mean, I was my deepest love is to the classical Western tradition, but I've never quite understood the notion that you're bound to despise popular music even when it's good, and I have known people like that. But I find it especially odd in this case when say in the case of the Beatles, because I always take the view that Leonard Bernstein took, which was that it doesn't matter if you understand what you're doing.
Yeah.
I think Bernstein said, talking about the chord progressions that you find in the Beatles, especially from like late '65 onward, he said it was like one of those child chess masters that you can only assume learned how to play the game in a previous life.
Yeah.
Because without knowing what they're doing, these, just some of the most incredibly sophisticated chord progressions you can imagine, with all sorts of subtleties. They might not have had the instrumental virtuosity of the Who, but they had this, I mean, the speaking in terms of just sheer composition.
Yeah, they're enthusiasmy, right? They've got the God inside.
I don't know what it is. I know what it is. I was like, even something like "I Am the Walrus," where the actual main tune varies only by about 2 or 3 notes, but the opening phrase has like 8 complex chords, and then the whole song is built on I think a structure of 16 chords that, I mean, are much more sophisticated than a lot of. Than a lot of Mozart, actually. I mean, I mean, that's not to say, but I just mean that, if you can do it, I guess you don't have to understand what you're doing, yeah. So yes. To make a long story short.
This is my attitude towards popular culture generally. I mean, there are legitimate critiques you can make about almost anything that's popular, but being a child of divorce raised in the '90s and early 2000s, it's like popular culture also kept me sane, through like a lot of things. And like, it's not entirely valueless. The deeper I've gone into higher education, the more I've been like, oh, a lot of the stuff that I love that's like, kind of lower brow, or that's like, plain stupid fun. I mean, it's actually written by really smart people who know about a lot of this stuff, right? So like Futurama is like arguably, you know, a lowbrow show, but it was written by 12 PhDs. You know, it was written by like one of the most educated staffs, show writing staffs in television history. So it's like, I mean, you know, I don't know. Anyway, yeah, no.
Well, that is the question: is you know, Revolver secretly a Gnostic text? You know. So,
yeah, of course.
By the time you get to Tomorrow Never Knows, I think you pretty much have an argument to make there.
Yeah. So I think one of the things your articles hit on that is really great is that Gnostics actually preserve, you know, better preserve in some sense, even than some of the Orthodox writers, the complex divine cosmos and hierarchy that, you know, as you've rightly pointed out, is just what all ancient people believe in. Sure. Or are rebelling against, if they're rebelling against it, you know, like Epicurus. But even Epicurus believes in gods. He just doesn't think they care.
He just thinks that, I mean, interspaces and all that.
Yeah. So I'm curious, you know, closely connected to this is, of course, like the pre-Copernican Ptolemaic cosmos, right? The gods are, I mean, celestial bodies are gods. There are gods beyond the celestial bodies, but celestial bodies are also gods. And one of the things that, you know, I think is intrinsic to a lot of the reclamation of classical, medieval, and Renaissance culture comes down to a recognition that, you know, the pre-Copernican cosmos is not literally true. And you mentioned this to some extent, I think, in That All Shall Be Saved. I think you have a portion of your essay, one of your essays about this. It's not literally true, but it is beautiful, and it makes a kind of sense. Like there's something metaphysically compelling to it.
I've said that. I don't think I said it in that book necessarily. I mean, I've said it.
May have been elsewhere.
You know, yeah, and I mean, you know, Ptolemy himself was engaged in the enterprise of saving the appearances. He didn't necessarily actually, you know, late antique astronomers didn't necessarily believe in the reality of such things as epicycles. These were devices for calculating the heavenly dance, so to speak, that made it mathematically calculable. You know, I mean, but they didn't necessarily, you know, or equins.
So sorry.
That's all right.
Yeah, that's actually somebody outside. Dogs, you want to go outside? Go outside. Go outside. No? All right. Sorry, we only have one, Daisy, but we are hosting friends this weekend, and so their dog Fitz is also very excitable about our neighborhood.
Fine with me. I never object to dogs.
Yeah. So yeah, and I think what you're describing is one of the reasons that, like, I often tell my students, and I often tell people when I'm engaged in this kind of conversation, you know, Ptolemy is a better cosmologist than Galileo is, despite the fact that Galileo is more right than Ptolemy is in the long run of things.
Well, right. I mean, in fact, Galileo wasn't actually a particularly proficient mathematical astronomer. I mean, it required Kepler and Newton and others who could think in terms of ellipses rather than circular orbits to begin to clarify the picture. Galileo was, you know, he's concerned with the physics of the issue, whether, you know, whether or not the Earth moves or not. But Ptolemy's system is internally coherent. The Copernican system, as Galileo adopted, is in fact inconsistent. He would have done better to go with Tycho Brahe, yeah, this is true. You know, Galileo's one correct insight, and that's also why he had a hard time proving it, to be honest. Because his cosmology, for instance, you didn't, if, among other things, encompass the sheer size of the distances involved, right? Parallax was a problem as a result for him. That, he didn't have the empirical proof or the theoretically coherent model to offer, which is why, among other things, he could be rebuked so sternly by a pope whom he defended. Right. Had he been able to produce the evidence in good faith, they wouldn't have been able to get away with silencing him.
Yeah. Although I rarely feel pity for Galileo, because he was put on house arrest in a Tuscan villa. I mean,
yeah, I have to say, would that we were all to suffer so savage. Savage a penalty. He was also provided with servants and a cook and food and wine. Yeah, I mean, it wasn't exactly the Bastille or the Tower. I don't. But the whole episode is absurd. The more you read this, or you realize it's such a completely anomalous episode. Anyway, but anyway. Yeah. Yes. So, but in the ancient world, and also in addition to this, you had Deuteronomy telling people that in the room in which they have read in the Septuagint, even most Jews would have read it in the Septuagint, not in the Masoretic text that, after all, didn't become standard in its complete form until the 9th century CE. There, the nations are divided among the sons of El, among the angels or the gods, to be precise, to be honest. So there was also, this, as you know, feeds into Jewish apocalyptic as well. The angels of the nations, the gods of the nations were aside. Then there are the gods of the heavenly spheres, or the rulers. And between the highest of the heavenly places, the heaven of heavens, or the Empyrean, or whatever you would call it, there were countless demones, lesser divinities who were more or less the postal service between God and the world below. I mean, for most people, most of us had the whole idea, of course, of the of guardian angel, is in keeping with the notion that everyone had a guardian daemon. That was widely, except for, of course, for Plotinus, because his guardian spirit was actually a god, as we discovered. Yes, he didn't tell us that, but this was discovered, and it's right there in Porphyry's life.
Yes,
that's I mean, talk about name dropping.
No, that's.
I went and played guitar with my friend Paul McCartney. You may have heard of him.
So I'm interested kind of talking about this. So, as you've also pointed out, and as I think is increasingly recognized more and more in good scholarship on Paul, on the Gospels, etc., this picture of the cosmos is really essential also to New Testament texts. It's essential to our concept of angelic archons and of daimons and of all of it. And we also know that minimally the shape of the cosmos, as the ancients understood it, is not literally true. So if we're going to retain angelic archons and daimons, we have to translate it into a new cosmology, right? Would you, how do you, are you interested in that kind of translation? How would you do it?
Well, I mean, I don't want to turn into one of those esotericists, who, comes up with their own system. I simply say that every human religious culture other than the mechanist post-Christian culture has recognized that nature is full of vital presences, intelligent presences, other than the human, the spiritual beings, and has had an awareness of them, both benign and malign, or even in some sense perhaps neutral. I often think that Paul's view of a lot of the angels was that they were dicey. You get this very much in Jewish tradition. I mean, where an angel can, on the one hand, be an evil angel in some sense, and yet at the same time turn out and show up in another text of the same period as one of the servants of God. of Hashem without there being any contradiction there. So the angels are sort of, you know, uh, of questionable intelligence, questionable loyalty. I don't know what. Right. But when in Galatians, Paul says, the law, it tells us that the law is imperfect because the angels wrote it. God didn't write the law of Moses; the angels did, and they, made a bit of a hash of it. And this kind of nasty stuff, like you touch the mountain, you die. I mean, my goodness, what sort of law is that? And then it went through a human mediator. So suddenly the fact that Moses is the intermediary further diminishes its credibility. You realize that Paul lives a very different universe than later Christians did. Where angels and demons are neatly discriminated. Demons are fallen angels, which they wouldn't have been for Paul. Mm-hmm. They would have been the children of rebel angels. They would have been
the divine half of the Nephilim that survived the flood.
Yeah. Well, the 1/3 of the Nephilim who were allowed to roam the earth rather than be confined in Tartarus or wherever. To test the faithful. That's an agreement Mastema worked out with God. But I mean that's the world of Paul, right? So how do you recover that? Well, I mean you don't have to. Again, on the one hand, I don't want to do the Wittgensteinian thing and say, well, the real right, that really, DZ Phillips or DZ Phillips, a wonderful man, but at the end, basically, no one really has any propositional content in their faith. It gets to the point where, it doesn't matter what Paul concretely believed. He believed what he was really doing was indicating a certain spiritual or existential disorder in things. I don't want to go in that direction, because I don't believe in the disenchanted cosmos. I don't believe in the mechanistic picture of reality. I really believe that that nature is full of spiritual presence. But I don't want to turn into like John Dee, revising the angelic hierarchies according to some new inspiration I received from somebody who apparently appeared in my study claiming to be Uriel, or whoever, and simply say that the Ptolemaic cosmos was not, well, I suppose you could go Owen Barfield on and say, well, who says it wasn't really the physical time? Consciousness is altered, so the physical universe we inhabit now is itself just a product of consciousness, or just not just a product, but a union of consciousness with a sort of mana or divine potentiality out there. But I mean, I do think it's important that we not surrender the early Christians to all the false exegeses that ultimately contributed to the desiccation of the Christian imagination and ultimately the end of a Christian vision of reality. I think that the more one fails to grasp that Paul lives in a world full of fairies, or whatever you want to call the Logaiva, and that this is a matter of serious theological concern, and think that he's talking about things he's not talking about. Emphasizing something about justification through hearing that has no cosmological context, not realizing that what one is hearing is the call, that almost like the Gnostics, are hearing a message that has been hidden from the foundations of the world, in part due to a kind of cosmic hostility to that message that liberates my spirit to be in contact with the God who is beyond all those intermediate powers that want to prevent me from being joined to God. We can't surrender the picture of early Christianity to the false, sanitized proto-secularized version that became dominant.
Sorry.
I mean, I'm glad to hear that they agree with me.
Yes. I've cured Daisy of her Epicureanism, so I think that she's slowly coming around to some of these ideas. I like though you mentioned the hearing, and of course part of the idea there is that when Paul speaks, right, he thinks particularly speaking the kerygma, he's transmitting pneuma through his words, and it's entering the ears, right? And it is this very concrete thing. And I mean, like Acts talks about Paul fighting a river, right? It's not just a river. It's not just a river, it's a river god. And I think it's things like that that make me, on the one hand, I want as a historian to encounter, the Jesus movement in the first century through its literature, the early Christians that sort of derive from them in all of their strangeness in the other world of the past. But I also then there's just that task of saying, well, but I'm not doing that just so I can write it off as so much nonsense. I'm doing it so that I can be with them as it's possible to be with them in my own context, right?
And that means not omnivorously digesting their world and turning it into the present. It doesn't mean let's be good Gadamerans here and talk about emerging of horizons. Recognize that their context is as much a challenge to our vision of things as our supposedly sophisticated scientific worldview alienates us supposedly from theirs. Helps us remember that actually the scientific worldview is in part a factitious construct, and in another sense doesn't have anything to say about the spiritual constitution of nature. It's only, it's a discourse of measuring quantities and velocities, and so forth and so on. But yeah, I mean, and also, I mean, you may remember that my first article in the series of Gnosticism was inspired by a column written by someone that I definitely did not accuse of being Rod Dreher, in which all sorts of claims were being made about how the modern age is totally Gnostic. How modernity is the whole world woke and found itself Gnostic. As he actually says that, borrowing the line from, and of course nothing could be farther from the truth. I mean, we'd be so much better off if that were the case. I mean, you can work with Gnosticism. It's much harder to work with confirmed materialism, even materialism that's dissembled on the part of people who think they also believe in God, because their picture of God is just the God who created capitalism or whatever, or created the material machine we inhabit, which is still materialism. And of course the bromide of bromides, the sort of unreflective. We must remember that salvation is not from the flesh, but of the flesh, and it's and you think, how can anyone? It just shows you the power of theological indoctrination. Is Paul doesn't hide his meaning on this. I mean, he is not at all subtle on this. Flesh and blood can't inherit the kingdom of heaven. You have to be liberated from flesh. I mean, the outer man, literally, I think for him means the body of flesh. The outer man is striving with the inner man, which is, which has been inspirited, perhaps, or is spirit already, But I mean, there's a real physiological sense that the possession of the members, the physical fleshly members of the body of death, vies against the spirit in us. And you don't even have to make a distinction, say whether he's talking about the human spirit or the divine, because that's a distinction that he often elides.
Yeah. My sole objection to Dale Martin is I agree with his thesis entirely, with the sole exception that when he talks about the resurrection body as a sloughing off, it seems to me that Paul's metamorphosis. That's more
real transformation. I think Paul believes that flesh and blood, you escape from them by death, right? But then it really is that same body that's transformed into a spirit into spirit along with all of creation. The age to come will be an age of spirit, or hospitable to, or reconstituted, having a spiritual frame. So sloughing off is probably the wrong language to use, because that suggests that it's simply a matter of escaping from the prison of the flesh. And that would be a good Orphic image, and it might be not entirely alien to what Paul's saying, but Paul's still a Jew, and he's thinking of a specific kind, a Pharisaic kind. He has a theology of resurrection, and that resurrection is not the revival. Remember, the Pharisees were fairly well-trained Hellenistic philosophers. People forget the Pharisees were not a sectarian orthodoxy. They were actually very Hellenized in their intellectual tradition. From what we can tell, is that for the resurrection, by resurrection, what they mean is this transformation, of an embodiment in an angelic or a spiritual form.
Yeah, and I think this is the only way for me to reconcile, and I mean, this is a theological task rather than a historical one, but it's the only way that I can reconcile what Paul says with Luke's account of the resurrection, is just to say, well, Jesus's like fleshy kinds of post-resurrection appearances are not Jesus in his ascended, glorified final state, so to speak,
Yeah, or just, I mean, Luke's not, let's be honest, not as consistent, or he's certainly not, he apparently doesn't work from a philosophical context quite the way Paul does. Our one metaphysical moment in Acts, in him we live and move and are, may actually be a quotation. I mean, I have no doubt that Paul would have been quite freely would say that, but when he talks about Paul and the Pharisees in the book of Acts, the construction of the language there suggests that he knows that the Pharisees understand resurrection as spirit or angel. Is certainly grammatically is a very weird sentence. It doesn't seem at all to mean that they didn't believe in the well, first of all, why would it be in the singular? It doesnn't say they didn't believe pneumata, or angelos.
Yeah.
But so I don't know. I mean, but you may be right. I mean, there may have been this language, don't touch me, I have not yet ascended to my, that might have been part of the early church tradition, is that there's the empty tomb, but then there's the full glorification,
I think there were just different. I think there were different understandings of it, right?
Oh yeah, no, yeah.
Yeah, C.D. Elledge's.
I don't really see. I don't feel a need to reconcile the Lucan narrative and the Pauline language. I'm not. Again, I'm not a fundamentalist in that sense. I believe that they had the profound experience of the resurrection. Conceptually, what they made of it, I think that's very much a human element of the text.
Yeah, for my own faith in Christ's resurrection, I'm sort of at the point where I believe Jesus rose. I don't believe that there are Jesus bones somewhere in a tomb, and I'm also fully comfortable talking about Jesus's resurrected body as a pneuma, or as a spirit, or as a fully angelified, deified corpus. And that's basically all that keeps me Christian at this point, I think, is that I believe that happened.
And Paul of course speaks of Christ as the life-giving spirit, and I think he does mean just that he means that the risen Lord, the one who is marked out by resurrection by that same spirit, that will raise us, is himself now fully spirit as risen, and therefore is the life-giving. I mean, that I think that's what the last Adam language refers to. Yeah, no, I understand what you mean. The thing is, you talk about clinging. It is true that the one thing, if I ever, temperamentally, I'm quite happy just being a syncretist without any fixed abode. But it is true that the account of the resurrection in 1 Corinthians 15, but of the witnesses, and of the sheer historical perplexity of why the Christian community survived and thrived in a way that, say, the followers of Theudas didn't.
Mm-hmm.
I've always thought that that's one place where, say, Wolfhart Pannenberg was right, is that the historical evidence of something extraordinary having happened, which everyone basically, and again, I rely on 1 Corinthians 15, not the gospel narratives, which are all clearly embellished and based on traditions that have been heard and reheard and altered, but, with a common core. The women got there first. Yeah. So when we construct Catholic culture, let's exclude them from all power, or whatever.
I don't know if you saw
You can see the brilliant rationale there. Yeah.
Yeah.
I saw yours. It was very good. But I'm talking now, so be quiet, child.
Sorry. Yes.
I've totally lost the thread. I don't remember what I was talking about, so I'm sorry.
Cool.
But yeah, no, it's 1 Corinthians 15 talking about those who saw the risen Christ is the sheer mundane nature of this report, the matter-of-factness, the numbers adduced. This is not like a sighting of Elvis, at the grocery store. This isn't, he's not talking about some excitable, he's talking about a number of concrete experiences on the part of people who, by all the logic, all historical precedent, should really have scattered and fallen apart, reuniting. And then, of course, Paul bearing witness to the fact that he met with the apostles, he talked to them, that the experience, he learned of the experience, but his own experience, the nature of his conversion, which doesn't strike me as plausible in the sort of banal psychological terms people would try to impose on it. He had a psychotic episode and decided it was Jesus.
Yeah,
that's not the issue. That actually, curiously enough, that's where I find myself unable to come up with a plausible counter narrative if I wanted to, because sometimes when I'm arguing with, say, the infernalist faction, which is, after all, 95% of the church, both Christian, I sometimes think, maybe this whole religion is just a way, this.
I would comfortably be Jewish or Muslim, I think, if it were possible or licit to just view Jesus as a deified prophet in mainstream Judaism. Pinchas Lapid believed that, but just Pinchas Lapid, effectively. And if it were a mainstream Muslim belief to, think of Jesus as having died and risen again, I know that Ismailis believe that, but that's not, it's not mainstream in the Islam.
Well, Ismailis are a special case, aren't they?
Not irrelevant to our Gnostic talks, certainly.
No, but yeah, and also but also with a fascinating intellectual and spiritual tradition is I can see myself as a Sikh or Baha'i or something.
I like how
any number of possibilities, but really what I would be just a dilettante, which is probably what I am anyway. But no, it is hard to get away from that, and I think it clearly something of that the event happened. Trying to reduce the event to something you can interpret in simple terms, is the mistake. Paul clearly has a handle on what he believes happened, because he has a semi-stoic understanding of the stichia of the cosmos, with sort of that general Platonizing tendency that was the part of the lingua franca also of the Hellenistic Greco-Roman world. and I think it's he's talking in terms of spirit and flesh. Luke is telling the story as best he can, and that for him in that part of the gospel, he uses spirit in its vulgar sense, meaning a ghost, because it can also be used. I mean, is the problem with the multivalency of words, obviously.
Yeah.
So and so he emphasizes something else, and yet in the narrative in Acts, we have what sounds like he's repeating the kind of language that people were really using speculatively in the course of the debate that he's trying to recount.
Yeah. And then, I mean, John, in John's gospel, John's Jesus points to his, I think Candida Mas is right, that it's his scars from not actual live wounds. But then at the same time, the whole thrust of John is very clearly that the Logos becomes flesh to impart pneuma, because flesh, the flesh profits nothing, right? Only the pneuma gives life. I mean,
right.
It's to say that John's Jesus is going to remain permanently in some sort of sarkic state just sort of bucks against the whole logic of the gospel.
Well, also, I mean, there's no reason to think that for John, the spiritual body would be intangible. I mean, it's capable of being whatever it can be. It can be, pass through locked doors, but also eat, break bread. There would be no reason why a higher corporeality would lack any of the powers in a lower form. In fact, it would almost certainly be metaphysically assumed by most that virtually it would possess all powers of the lower body in a higher and more refined state, and it'd be a matter of how to express themselves. There's no reason to see in the palpability of the wounds of the risen Christ any claim that this is not a spiritual body.
Yeah. No, that's a fair qualification, for sure. So we're talking about, by the way, are you good on time? I want to be respectful of your time.
I getting near the end, not okay. Just, I mean, as you can tell from my voice, because of this lung condition of mine, I can only go for so long before I begin.
Yeah. Let's just skip kind of ahead then, and this can be a last question. As always, I hope you'll do this again at some point. But
we'll talk money.
Yeah.
I really should charge for my time. The reason I do so many of these interviews now is just because the COVID got me in the habit of wanting to have conversations with people who weren't there. So, in a sense, it's become second nature now. Anyway, yeah.
And then out of charity, you agreed to talk with me, which is,
We're talk at you. I mean, that's
we're talking at me, however.
Right. So what's this last question? Come on, Skippy. Let's get in.
Yeah. So in your last article on Gnosticism, you talk about the formation of basically a new romanticism to perform this act of, and I don't know if you would describe it as an act or simply a change in the way that we see the cosmos to re-enchant the modern cosmos. There's obviously so much, there's so much scholarship on enchantment, disenchantment, re-enchantment. We don't necessarily need to get into that. I'm more just curious, how do we take this from appreciation of art? Like, how do we take that Gnostic sensibility that the world as we are experiencing it in its fallen state does divide us from God, while at the same time believing that like the world is shot through with, creative energies and divine beauty and all of this stuff? How do we take that from just, we're reclaiming culture to forming culture? I mean, you're kind of already doing it in your writing, but what kinds of things should we be doing to create this?
Well, if the future is just dependent on the influence of my writing, then we're in a sad situation. Because would that more, the thing is, even a lot of Christians, of course, have been taught to believe that their faith was a faith of disenchantment, right? That it evacuated nature of the illusion of gods and spirits, and then taught us this sort of austere monotheism that would be somehow mitigated if there were other spiritual agencies within the fold, and that already that sort of ideology of disenchantment that so much say, to be honest, of the Protestant narrative, but also, frankly, is part of the sensibility of early modern Catholicism too. I mean, it's the sort of theologies of nature and supernature that you've seen me object to so vigorously in the past are complicit in this same demotion of the natural order from theophany to inferential evidence of a creator. Actually, I like that distinction. I've got to remember to say that as a theophany inferential. I think I've come up with a new antithesis. But I mean, it's true. I mean, one of the reasons the sort of Banesian Thomism of the 16th century offends me is because in many ways it's the mechanical philosophy plus supernature, even if it's still using Aristotelian categories for nature. They've been mechanized in that sense because they've lost that element of genuine supernatural influence that's even there, well, at least in the Neoplatonic readings of Aristotle. I won't say one way or the other about Aristotle, but the point I'm making is that we have to disabuse ourselves of the narrative that makes Christianity continuous with this exorcism of nature. Quite the contrary. In fact, most of Christian centuries, there was no sense, none. There may have been a tendency to suspect only the worst of nature spirits, to think of them as, if not demonic, at least inherently mischievous and dangerous, which is only true of those damned leprechauns, to be honest, and some of the fairies in the Balkans who are, let's be honest, a little bit fascistic. But for the most part, you're going to find that the fairy world is made up of really delightful social democratic socialist sorts who intend you no harm, except occasionally, they might steal some cake from your larder or something. But, you got to, just fight back against centuries of bad theology. It's not as if secular is, not as if the mechanization of nature is something that descended on us from above. It's something that was incubated within a rather corrupt vision of nature and supernature that for some reason took hold on the threshold of the early modern period. Already in late scholastic theology, the more it turns towards a voluntarist relationship between God and creation, it's already rendered creation mute as an actual manifestation of God in himself or anything other than pure power. So that's the beginning, is trying to rescue Christianity, the Christian vision from Christianity, as much of it. And I suspect that means trying to dissolve the very categories of distinct religions and religious traditions, and even trying to dissolve the category of Christianity as a unified historical cultural phenomenon. But this struggle's been going on since the Renaissance, right? I mean, that was the first big kick back against the late scholastic. People think of the Renaissance as simply a rejection of the Middle Ages, as logic chopping, scholasticism, some of that, yes. But the real objection is to a late scholasticism that was the dominant philosophical and theological argot of much of the Catholic world in Italy and elsewhere, that really was a deplorable tradition of thought. can we accomplish? What can be? I don't know, but I know that the mythology of the benign and if you bring up the issue of economics, it is very hard fighting through the sense that, the only way prosperity, or the only kind of prosperity, or the only kind of wealth that can be created that's necessary to alleviate poverty and so forth, is capitalist wealth. Well, I mean, first of all, has capitalism really alleviated poverty in the world? Certainly, given certain people the ability to earn more money and to acquire more things than they might otherwise have done. But it's not what you would call a system of fair distribution. It also relies on the preservation of a cycle of wealth in which there's a constant alienation of wealth to the richest, and in which the wealth possessed even by those we call middle class or lower middle class continues to atrophy in its actual in what it can actually purchase, right? And this is just part of the natural dynamism of an investment economy that's based purely on capital and the limited liability corporation with global reach, right? But it also, I mean, it means producing hundreds of thousands of tons of waste that ends up washing up on the shores or being literally shipped to and dumped upon impoverished populations, and the exploitation of impoverished populations in low-cost labor areas in the world, and the imposition of or the impossibility, sort of the active. Anyway, getting off track. The point is that the mythology that we have to fight against is almost as pernicious. It is as pernicious, and it's almost as powerful as the actual material wealth possessed by those who want you to believe it.
And this is to my mind. Sorry if I can cut in. Is that okay?
Yeah, because I'm not going anywhere. I mean,
okay.
Precise.
This is the value to me, the enduring value of an apocalyptic messianism as opposed to a purely progressive one. It's not that it's not that I look down on like a progressive messianism, but what I find continuously and consistently is that just the sheer amount of power that is needed to break the spell, whether it is the intellectual spell that lies on the world, or it is the entrenched way that wealth and power reinforce each other. What these demonic archons and their human empires that they rule through and all the people they oppress. It's like, the progressive messianic dream of like, we'll bring about the messianic era through following the teachings of Jesus, or through, I teach in a Jewish day school, so like through Tikkun Olam or whatever. It's like, I buy that as what we should be doing. But in terms of actually like saving the world, it would be really great if God would do some of the smashing of the mighty and the rich and the powerful that he's always talking about. You
see, I have known some who vest great hope in in capitalism collapsing under the weight of its own contradictions. There's several problems here, though. One is it will probably only do that when it's exhausted so many of the material resources of the world that the world will then be an irrecoverable mess to begin with. The collapse of the system is basically predestined by virtue of the way it sustains the economy to produce suffering on an untold scale. But at the end of the day, the real problem is I'm not sure capitalism has any contradictions, because it's nothing but a system for commodifying everything. I mean, it even commodifies dissent from capitalism. I mean, you look at the revenues made on T-shirts for Occupy Wall Street alone. I mean, just it's late capitalism, especially, is if it can be branded and can be sold.
Yeah. When the rich
I mean,
money off of Eat the Rich, right?
Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt.
No, that's precisely the point I was making. So I don't know. I know that people who consider themselves Christians need to start thinking in a way. If we live, I mean, of course, we live in America, which is the epicenter of stupid on everything. I mean, there's not only in America. Okay. Could you create a culture of conservative Catholics who actually believe that Christianity, Catholicism, requires them to defend capitalist economics? Now, there's less and less of that, of course, because there's also this sort of phalangist right wing that's rising in the Catholic Church. Okay, we're against capitalism, but because we associate it with Jews, or something, so you get them too. But what I mean is people like who are those? The Packalooks, socialist. You can't be a socialist and a Christian. How could a pious Catholic dare to say that when there have been so many in the 20th century alone? In Europe, there were so many saintly Catholics, Christians in good standing who were openly democratic socialists. I mean, it's just, only in America do we have, could you have produced a Catholic culture that's so thoroughly Protestant, and a Protestant culture that's so thoroughly secular, and a secular culture that's so thoroughly fundamentalist. I mean, there's some incredibly unwholesome influence in the way ideas and convictions take shape among Christians in America. And America still is, whether we like it or not, the engine of it. Maybe not of the world. It is the engine of the world economy, but it also, whether we like it or not, determines for now much of what's possible in the world of international capital, because it's the only country on earth that has the power actually to revise the relationship between capital and the state. Everywhere else, with perhaps now the exception of China, but everywhere else, basically it's the markets that dictate to governments what laws they're going to pass. Now, that is the case here too, but it needn't be. The US Treasury has the power to be a counterbalance if it wants to be, but
yeah. So all of this just to the point that
the hell am I talking about? I mean, I must be drunk. I'm just going on from one topic to another. No matter, there really is a digressive quality to talking to you. I can see why you call this thing a perennial digression.
I was really trying to come up with a name that, I don't know, I could say and mean it, and that was the only thing that could come to mind. Is just
cultivation of a Japanese aesthetics.
Oh, okay.
That's another thing we need. That a romanticism filtered through wabi-sabi, yugen, mononoawari, iki, all of the Japanese aesthetic values, I think.
Yeah. A friend of mine once asked me, how I would feel if and it was an absurd situation he suggested, at least in the details that he was suggesting it, but he was like, how would you feel if China took over the United States? And I was like, well, probably my public spaces would look a lot nicer.
Yeah, I was about to say we'd actually have a working infrastructure. I don't know.
It doesn't sound so bad.
They would definitely deal with gun violence in a much more efficient way. They would, they wouldn't be allowing imbeciles to be running around with semi-automatic, high velocity, sort of military grade weapons. Yeah, I can see certain real benefits in being taken over by China.
Yeah. These are, so all of this just to say that, and we talked about this a bit last time when we talked about Kali Yuga, and I know we're getting close to when we need to end. It just seems to me that, Kali Yuga is so ubiquitous, like the nature of this fallen cosmos or the rule of the archons or whatever. It's so like short of actual revolution, it's literally impossible. And oftentimes the revolutionaries end up just reifying the system, right?
Yeah.
And so
yeah, no, it's true.
Yeah, and so I think.
Well, I mean, what happens? The revolution it makes a shambles, and then it needs international capital to rebuild.
Yeah, and so this is why I think I feel endlessly caught between Irenaeus and Origen on eschatology. The older I get, and the less likely some sort of historically future parousia seems to me, the more Origen seems to appeal. But on the other hand, I think to myself, well, that does kind of just leave history and all of its sufferings to the claws and the clutches, of evil.
Yeah, I mean, I can't really say that this tension between, I talk about romanticism in a sense. Romanticism is also just a name for a tendency that's been latent or resurgent throughout Christian history, just like Gnosticism, one that, a kind of creation mysticism. Don't call it a nature mysticism if you don't want to, and I think that tension remains perennial. When we're nearing a point of crisis as we are now, I mean, for me, it gets very simple. I'd rather that the monarch butterfly not be extinct in the next 20 years. Why? Because I believe that the monarch butterfly is a higher good than any of the garbage we produce in our worthless, throwaway consumer culture. But the power to make that determination lies with men and women of the investment class, the shareholder class, who, to be honest, as far as I can tell, are the only true absolute nihilists that history has ever produced. They really seem to think the world is dispensable if it can be converted into sufficiently large numbers on a computer screen indicating bank accounts and portfolios. This goes beyond any sort of Pythagorean adoration of number. This is a nihilism for which we don't yet have a proper name. I don't even know what to call it, because it's not just the nihilism that says, well, I will when I will, I desire when I desire. There's no horizon of absolute values. It really is an active desire to reduce everything to nothingness for the sake of wealth that is totally abstract, which is not the wealth of life. I mean, basically, as far as I can see, the capitalist utopia is 2 or 3 persons with bank accounts in the trillions living in a world that has been reduced to a sewer. And that's the triumph of capitalism. It's productivity that is basically the exhaustion of a diminishing ecosystem. And there doesn't seem to be anyone there to talk to, which is why I spoke of it as the machine, because there's no one agency there. It's the thing that's one of the things that's so insidious about the power of global capital is it's a distributed power. It reasserts itself. It's like a cancer that keeps springing up in different organs of the body everywhere. You try to cure it here, but it simply appears there, or it is there as well. Again, I guess if you took sort of the Chinese autocratic approach, you can bring it all under your control. But as we've seen, the Chinese government isn't exactly overly solicitous of the ecology either. You know, they because this notion of catching up with and surpassing the West means hyper industrialization as well. Whole cities that are where the air is basically composed mostly of heavy metals, as far as I can tell. And who's on the other side of that? Maybe you do have to hope for a total collapse. You know, hope at the same time that the sciences will come up with enzymes that can break down plastics in the ocean. You know, hope for any number of things. Agitate for any number of things. But all I can say at the beginning is, first of all, correct your sensibility, know what it is that you're fighting against, wake up from the illusion that wealth and the illusion that everything has to be gradualist, and certainly wake up from the myth of disenchantment as some sort of benign truth of the Christian dispensation, and recognize that it's a perverted modern fantasy. But at the end, it may turn out that the Gnostic impulse is the wisest one, because you may have to throw your hands up in the air and say, "Well, that was a good world while it lasted." You know, it wasn't great; it had its problems, but there was a lot of nature. Yeah. It's really beautiful. A lot of species. Butterflies are, you know.
Yeah, you know, I often, well, and I mean, in our contemporary Imaginarium, partially influenced by, you know, our scientific culture. I mean, this is often one of the things that we imagine. We don't have evidence for this, right? But this is one of the things we imagine prevents, if there are civilizations elsewhere in the universe, them from getting to any kind of point where we might interact with them, is that they all do this to themselves. It's sort of
right. There's the machine is sort of a cybernetic algorithm written into the very structure of material existence. The machine will build itself and then to consume itself, given any sort of basic economic activity. You know, there's always that possibility.
Yeah, and I'm comfortable with the. Oh, go ahead, please.
Yeah. But I like not to be too fatalistic about it. But I mean, yeah, I mean, one does wonder whether it's even an escapable condition.
Yeah. I'm comfortable with the idea that, you know, I tend to think that there are probably
damn frontal lobes, you know, that's the problem.
Yeah.
Beotany.
Be much
soft
happier.
Skulls and big brains. Yeah.
Yeah. Be much happier as an orangutan for sure. But, you know, I mean, I tend to think probably there are other creatures more or less like ourselves in the universe. I know, as you've written, there are other creatures more or less like ourselves right here, right? Dogs and apes and animals of all sorts, and plants too. Yeah. You know, and I think probably this happens to some of them. I think probably the fall, you know, if the cosmic fall is not a temporal event in our history, but a cosmic condition of the universe as it now exists, then obviously that would be inclusive of aliens just as much as it is of us. But yeah, I mean, I guess I just hope that there is some sort of contingent intervention, divine or otherwise, on the horizon.
Yeah. Alternatively, maybe, you know, you've got a planet of highly technologically advanced Taoist lizards who will come and impose humane order on us. Turn us all into deep green anarcho-socialist pacifists who spend our days making pottery and writing poetry and gamboling through fields full of butterflies. You know,
sounds wonderful.
I'm all for it. I'm all for conquest by the Taoist lizards from beyond. I mean, you know,
yeah.
I say we put up neon signs inviting them, come conquer. You know.
Yeah. Well, this is why the UFO thing was so fun the last 2 years. You know, like the government basically, you know, gaslights people about UFOs for years, and whatever they actually are, just the government being publicly like, yeah, I don't know what that is. That might be an alien. I'm over here with my big sign, like, please be an alien. Please come. Please come.
I'm afraid you're probably destined for disappointment on that score. But you never know. You never know. Yeah. I think you'll find that these are actually explicable malfunctions within instrumentation and things like that. But I happen to know someone who I trust implicitly, but who also has a little touch of the second sight. He tends to see things that others don't see, who had a kind of UFO experience, some large thing. And I asked him, well, I don't know, maybe that's what angels look like in the modern world, interpreted through the modern consciousness, maybe it really was, in a sense, an extraterrestrial that Ezekiel saw. But the point is, I'm not a rationalist. All sorts of experiences out there that don't fit into the paradigm that we're told is reality. But if I'm resting my hope on an invasion by Taoist extraterrestrial lizards, I'm probably getting a little too desperate. And so I don't know. I'm going to just finish here. I'll just say, when I talk about cultivating a new romanticism, as opposed merely to sinking into Gnostic disenchantment, even though I think a certain Gnostic disenchantment is healthy for our relation to the world we think we know, especially as we've made it. At the end of the day, you have to love the things of Earth. You can see it is a matter of simply seeing them correctly, and there you see a beauty and a foretaste of transcendence spilling out of all things, transfusing all things, suffusing all things, and you can't surrender that love without fundamentally truncating your spiritual nature, your soul. So it's something worth devoting yourself to. It's something cultivating the proper sensibility in yourself and others, militantly resisting claims about economic necessity or practicality that try to sustain the system as we know it, and militantly resisting any suggestion that Christians have any business not believing in fairies.
Yes, more fairies.
Because, to be honest, I'm afraid that right now that's got to be part of the orthodoxy. It's got to go right in the creed, right after this, life of the world to come. And in the meantime, aren't fairies wonderful?
I believe in one God and in infinite gods and in infinite worlds. Look, if the world is big enough for aliens, it's big enough for fairies, it's big enough for government misdirection, it's big enough.
Well, there's also the fact that the same person who had that UFO experience did actually have a fairy experience that I take to be just simply a matter of practice, just simply objective fact.
Yeah, okay. Absolutely. That's as good a place as any to conclude. David, thanks again for doing this. I do hope we can do it again some other time.
Yeah, at some time, let's try a coherent conversation too. I'm occasionally capable of pulling one of those off when I'm, just to be mischievous.
Yes. At this point, the only digression is to stay on topic, really.
Right. I don't really even remember what the topic was, so there you have it. Peace.
Be well.
Bye.